Hello and welcome back to part 2 of session 10 for SOCH111 History of Healing, and the lecture is looking at the medical traditions from Japan and Korea, and we've looked at the traditions in Korea, and now we're moving on to look at some Japanese healing traditions and history. So we'll start with the history, and when we're looking at Japanese history, we're actually uncertain about the actual origins of human life in Japan. So historians have found Paleolithic tools that are dated to between 30,000 and 10,000 BCE, but there's not sort of more certainty around that. Migrations are believed to have occurred via a number of land bridges from Korea in the south into the southern and central Japan, as well as from the Soya and Tsugaru regions or provinces in the north of Japan. So different peoples have, it's understood, have migrated in these different pathways into Japan. Okay, so the migrations into northern Japan are understood as being from Northeast Asia and actually from Russia, and the central Japan from, as I say, from Korea. So between the 10th and the 3rd centuries BCE, the Jomon culture developed, and this was during the Mesolithic period. And historians have obviously identified some certain sort of primary sources of the history of their existence, particularly through some very unique and distinct pottery. Not a lot is known about this culture. Not a lot is known about the structure of society, and as a result, we actually don't know a lot about the medicine that was practiced in Japan at this time. What is understood is that it was a tribal society, and like many tribal societies, shamanistic type practices were adhered to, and necessarily along with that, notions of illness being ascribed to the influence of non-physical beings or entities. So between 300 BCE and 250 CE, the Yayoi culture emerged in mainland Japan. And from 250 to 538 CE, we have the first recorded historical period in Japan, which is referred to as the Kofun period. After this, 538 to 710 CE, we have the kind of evolution out of that tribal society and into a clan societal structure. So these tribal societies would have been familiarly based, kin-based tribal societies that, with the emergence of agriculture, would have become static in origin and would have become developed and evolved to greater levels. So this establishment of the clan societal structure led to the development of the feudal period in Japan. This is referred to as the Asuka period. And during this period, China was starting to exert quite a large influence on Japanese culture. Directly with exchange between China and Japan, and also indirectly through influence of Korean culture, and Korea and Japan also had quite a lot of exchange. So that was really taking off during this Asuka period between 538 and 710 CE. Okay, 794 to 1185 CE, we have the Heian period, and this is seen as being a period in the history of Japanese culture where the culture developed to a very high degree. After this, 1185 to 1868 CE, sorry, this was the rule of the shoguns, so the military rule over the country, the warrior warlords, essentially. And there are numerous shogunates that ruled over a number of dynasties. They called the emperor as their authority, their form of authority, but really the emperor was often a puppet, and who was subverted beneath the kind of will of the leading shoguns. And all this changed in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, where the emperor took back control of Japan and reasserted himself. This particular emperor reasserted himself as the actual political leader of the country. And we'll see as we go, the Meiji Restoration was a real turning point in the history and development of Japan as a nation, and as a increasing presence on the global platform or the global sphere. So, what religions are practiced in Japan? There's a general sense, I think, of the religions that are associated with Japan, and we're going to look at some of these, perhaps some better known ones and perhaps a few less well known religious practices in Japan as we move through this lecture. The indigenous religio-spiritual belief system of Japan is Shinto. So Shinto is an animistic form of religion which evolved and developed uniquely in Japan prior to the arrival of Buddhism from China and actually from Korea. It's a very interesting and diverse and disparate system of beliefs and practices that basically was not organized, not homogenized, and existed in numerous iterations all around the country prior to the arrival of Buddhism and after Buddhism as well. So the term itself didn't emerge until the 6th century CE, and it was only developed as a term to differentiate the indigenous spiritual practices of Japan from Buddhism, which had just arrived. And we're talking about Buddhism in terms of the form of Buddhism practiced in China, or forms of Buddhism practiced in China, which actually came to Japan via Korea. So Shinto means the way of Kami, and Kami translates as divinity, or sacred, or mystical, or superior. In casual terms, Kami has come to refer to gods, so it's often used to refer to gods or deities. So really, as it's commonly understood, Shinto means the way of the gods, worshipping the gods, and necessarily this suggests some form of polytheism. So the worship of numerous deities, and speaks to worshipping the divinity in nature. So all things are seen as being imbued with some form of spiritual presence, and each of these things are acknowledged, and some are worshipped and not all are worshipped, but all are acknowledged. Shinto is a really interesting religion. It is recognized as not actually having a founder. So it is something that's evolved as I mentioned just before, in numerous ways in numerous parts of Japan, with sort of similarities and differences. There's no official textual basis, so there's no religious scriptures, historically speaking, that sort of define the beliefs and practices of the religion. And as such, there's no strict dogma. Shinto is deeply interwoven into the Japanese belief system today. You can imagine that a culture that has developed alongside and embedded with the belief systems of Shinto would still to this day have those belief systems deeply well, I guess interwoven into the ways of thinking and the ways of being in the world. Obviously, Japan has Shinto origins, it has Buddhist origins, and the two have become intertwined together since the 6th century. So Japanese people commonly have some combined conception of Shinto beliefs and practices and Buddhist beliefs and practices, and a large percentage of the population ascribed today to a combined Buddhist and Shinto cultural and religious worldview. So there are 3 main types of Shinto. We have the Jinja Shinto, which is the Shinto associated with and practiced at shrines. Have Kyoha Shinto, which is the sect Shinto, and Minzoku Shinto, which is referred to as folk Shinto. And we'll just talk about these briefly. So the Jinja Shinto, shrine Shinto, is probably the most formalized presentation of Shinto seen in Japan. This is what's practiced by Shinto priests at particular shrines. And there are particular shrines around Japan that are related to particular deities, so recognized Shinto deities. And so worship at the shrine will involve worshipping and making offerings to a particular recognized deity. And there'll be a priest priests that facilitate that process. And obviously there will be people that go to these shrines to make offerings to those deities. Kyoha Shinto is sect Shinto. So over time, even though there was no actual official founder of Shinto, over time particular leaders have emerged within Shinto that have defined their own particular way of practicing Shinto and have built up separate groups that people often then join with and undertake those practices. So there are a number of sects of Shinto in play in the world today. And the third version of Shinto is Minzoku Shinto, or folk Shinto. If you're from Japan or you've been to Japan, very often it's very common to see just dotted along the street some small shrine, which is just not a particularly big altar, that is a place that's recognised once again as being associated with a particular deity, and where people make their own offerings to this deity. So it might just be a little shrine on the street, and you might just walk past it as you're walking down the street to wherever you're going. It's common to see this in the countryside, and also very often seen in the cities, and quite a unique expression of Shinto. Very often people who are adherents to the folk Shinto practices are also associated with a shrine. So there is crossover that occurs between these different versions or presentations of Shinto. Okay, Buddhism in Japan. So as I mentioned before, Buddhism, the Buddhism originally practiced in Japan was a Chinese form of Buddhism, but it actually arrived via Korea, so through Korea, in 552 CE. Initially it was met with opposition. Initially it was seen as being superstitious and a form of magic, and so there was a bit of resistance. But eventually it was accepted into Japanese culture by imperial decree, and Shinto started to become absorbed into the Buddhist framework. So from the 8th century onwards, we saw this kind of intermingling of the two religious traditions, or spiritual traditions, to form this kind of Buddhistic Shinto, which was quite interesting. What happened was a lot of Buddhist deities were connected up or named as being Shinto deities, and so there was a marrying of the kind of cosmological framework, or that polytheistic hierarchical structure, polytheistic hierarchical structure, in order to allow Buddhism to be absorbed into the ways of thinking that existed in Japanese people at the time. So for many years, until 1892, till the Meiji Restoration happened, the Buddhism and Shinto were kind of practiced hand in hand. During the Meiji Restoration, there was significant social, political and cultural overhaul that took place in Japan, and at that time the emperor decided it would be better to separate Shinto and Buddhism into two unique forms of spiritual practice, and so that's what happened at that time. So religion, power, politics intersected variously over the centuries, impacting the development of the differing versions or sects of Buddhism and Shinto, as well as the dominance of Chinese Taoism and Confucianism. One of the main contributions to Japanese culture was, of course, the Chinese language, and with the Chinese language came access to Chinese written texts, and a lot of the classical Chinese texts were obviously Buddhist texts, Confucian texts, Taoist texts, and obviously Chinese medical texts. So all of that sort of information started to get absorbed into the minds of Japanese people who were reading and writing Chinese, and these sorts of ideas then started to shape the thinking of Japanese people, and therefore Japanese culture. So Japanese culture started to take on these very Chinese concepts and evolved significantly as a result. Nevertheless, Shinto wasn't neglected, and so the basic moral ethical framework of Japanese people is still based on those Shinto beliefs. So, Buddhism in Japan. Basic principles of Buddhism. We start with the Four Noble Truths. So, the first is that in life there is suffering. The second noble truth, suffering has a cause. The third truth, there is a way to cease suffering. And the fourth truth is that the Noble Eightfold Path is the way to end suffering. If you're aware of Buddhism a little bit, you'd be aware of the Noble Eightfold Path, but basically it's a framework for the right way to live in the world, according to Buddhist belief. And so basically these four noble truths are acknowledging that there's difficulty in the world, acknowledging that there's pain in the world, acknowledging that there's a reason for that pain, acknowledging and pointing out that there's a way to end that pain, and then saying these Buddhist belief practices are the way to end that pain. This is a beautiful philosophy, and we have to think, well, why does this have something to play, a part to play in a discussion on medicine? And it comes back to this idea of suffering. So basically, the whole purpose of medicine is to ease people of their pain, ease people of their suffering, and the very kind of framework that Japanese culture and Chinese culture, Korean culture is built on is this idea in Buddhism that we can end suffering through this method of practice. So from that perspective, not only does it inform the beliefs of the people in the culture on a very deep level, but also it can be seen as being Buddhism can be seen as a form of preventative medicine. If you do these things, you can avoid suffering, you can avoid pain, you can avoid hardship, you can avoid illness. And so in that sense it is a form of preventative medicine, in that sort of larger holistic sense that we think about, or hopefully we think about when we're looking at holistic medicine. Okay, so then we move on to Zen. So Zen Buddhism is a particular type of Buddhism. The term Zen relates particularly to a method of practice of Buddhism in Japan, but one that originated in China. And the style of practice of Buddhism in China was called Chan Buddhism, which is a synthesis of Indian Mahayana Buddhism and Chinese Taoism. So once the Indian Buddhism moved to China, the local Taoist philosophies and practices were once again synthesized and absorbed into that Buddhist framework, and a unique expression of Buddhism emerged in China, which became known as Chan Buddhism. So this was founded by the Indian Buddhist patriarch Bodhidharma in China in the 6th century CE. And for those interested in martial arts, this was what was happening at the Shaolin Temple. Okay, this form of Buddhism spread to Korea in the 7th century CE, and eventually to Japan in the 12th century CE. So the important thing to note here is that more mainstream practices or versions of Buddhism arrived in Japan first. Chan Buddhism didn't arrive in Japan until much later, until the 12th century CE. So Chan Buddhism, once it arrived in Japan, took on its own unique characteristics and became what's now referred to as Zen Buddhism, which is a uniquely Japanese type of Buddhism. So, Zen Buddhism strips back scriptural dogma with the attempt to attain a direct experience of satori or enlightenment. So rather than being a form of Buddhism that's interested in morality or philosophy, although these things are certainly integral aspects of Zen, Zen Buddhism is very much about the individual person and their direct attempt at becoming enlightened. So it has a very high focus, a very strong focus on meditative practice and specific meditative practices. Okay, now we move on to Shingon and Mikkyo. So these terms may be a little less familiar to many people. Shingon is a form of esoteric Buddhism. So this form of Buddhism was introduced to Japan from China in the 7th century CE, so it actually has a longer history of development in Japan than Zen does, even though it's not as well known as Zen, it's not as popular as Zen. Mikkyo is a Japanese term for esoteric Buddhism, and is sometimes translated as secret teachings. So Shingon and Mikkyo are often used interchangeably, these terms. Shingon is the actual name for this type of Buddhism, and you could call it a form of tantric Buddhism, and has a lot of similarities to certain Tibetan Buddhist practices. So the practice is aimed at attaining enlightenment in this lifetime. Some versions of Buddhism don't have that initial aim. Some versions of Buddhism around the world think that it might take many lifetimes to achieve enlightenment. Shingon is more interested in doing it immediately. Teaching is transmitted from one person to another, often spiritually rather than verbally, which is quite an interesting concept to get your head around. How is teaching transmitted spiritually? How is teaching transmitted without the use of words? And the answer to that would be that it is a process that both the student and the teacher need to be actively engaged with, to the extent that they're able to understand and have mutual understanding of phenomena and concepts on non-verbal levels. So there are rites within Shingon practice that go right back to the esoteric Indian Buddhist practices. So there are some very ancient practices still existing within Shingon Buddhism today. Okay, let's take a look at the history of Japanese medicine. So, we need to once again go back to the time before Buddhism arrived in Japan and think about what was happening when Shinto was the predominant spiritual belief system that existed. So before the 6th century CE, the medical practices were very much shamanic-like practices. We have to be careful of using the term shaman, because this is a term that's been culturally appropriated, meaning that it's a term that Western researchers and perhaps anthropologists have used to apply against individual cultural practices of Siberia, North America and America, and used those terms to describe the practices of other cultures that have similarities to those practices. And we don't want to make those sorts of generalizations. We want to be culturally sensitive and recognize the practices unique to any given culture, and not label them incorrectly. So we could say perhaps they're shaman-like practices rather than being shamanic practices. Exorcisms were carried out, purifications were carried out, and there was a very kind of unevolved standard of herbal medicine being practiced in Japan before the 6th century. So exorcisms, purifications, shamanic-like practices all suggest that illness has a large part to do with the influence of negative and evil non-physical beings, or the spirit world, the influence of the spirit world. So Chinese medicine arrived in Japan via Korea once again in the 6th century CE, and a lot of things changed for Japan at that time, as I've mentioned. So at this time Japan adopted the Chinese alphabet, and as I mentioned earlier, this facilitated increased understanding of Buddhism, Confucianism, structure and administration of government, divination practices, and importantly, medicine. So, major acceptance of Chinese herbal medicine occurred with the arrival of Jianzhen, otherwise called Ganjin, in 753 CE. Jianzhen was a blind Chinese Buddhist priest who had a highly evolved sense of smell. So he could identify herbal ingredients by his sense of smell. So when he arrived in Japan, he brought Chinese medical texts, he brought Chinese herbal ingredients, he gave a vast number of treatments to ill people for free, and he openly shared his knowledge and skill. And so the Japanese people were deeply impressed by his compassion and his generosity and his deep knowledge of both Buddhism and Chinese herbal medicine. And as a result, the reputation of both those things grew in Japan. So Chinese herbal medicine became better recognized and better acknowledged, and Buddhism grew in popularity as well. So Jianzhen was a pivotal figure in the development of both Buddhism and medicine in Japan. All right, Kampo. So Kampo is the term used to describe herbal medicine practiced in Japan. It's the Japanese application of Chinese herbal medicine theory and treatment, but we don't want to simplify it by that term. It's informed by Chinese herbal medicine theory and treatment, and has evolved in its own way. So a transliteration of the word Kampo is the Chinese method, or the Chinese way. Kampo is heavily informed by two fundamental, definitive Han Dynasty Chinese herbal medical texts, and people in Chinese medicine know these texts very well. They're very famous, influential texts, and are used in practice of Chinese herbal medicine today, and obviously still used to inform the practice of Kampo medicine today. So these texts are the Shanghan Lun, which is the treatise on cold injury, and the Jingui Yaolue, which is the essential prescriptions of the Golden Cabinet, which is a lovely poetic title to this book. So they're both written by another pivotal figure in Chinese medicine history, Zhang Zhongjing. Originally they were a single book, but they have over time been separated into two distinct books. The Shanghan Lun was the kind of predominant Chinese medical texts that recognised the effect of external pathogenic invasions for causing people to become unwell. And it chiefly ascribed illness to the influence of external cold, so cold pathogens in Chinese medicine, as well as numerous variations on that, of course. But it was able to describe chiefly how illness entered the body, the pathways that it took to get into the body, and then it's the pathogenesis once that illness was in the body. How did it develop to affect a person? What were the signs and symptoms that related to a given level of injury based on these pathogens? So it's a highly developed, highly nuanced book, and it also included and includes today a vast number of very powerful, very effective Chinese herbal medicine formulas that, as I say, are still used in clinical practice today. So the ingredients used in these texts include oyster shell, dragon bone, gypsum, and talc. So quite a unique application of Chinese herbal ingredients. All right, so Campo was largely informed by Chinese medical theory, Chinese medical texts, and the use of Chinese herbal medicine ingredients for quite some time, for a long time, uninterrupted, right through the sort of feudal period of Japan's history. And things started to change when Japan started to receive interest from countries in the West. So Portuguese traders and missionaries brought Western medicine to Japan around 1590. So at that time, Japanese medicine scholars took that information and started to try to unpick it, try to understand it. So they analysed it, they took the concepts, and then they started to integrate these concepts into their own system of Campo. And this is a process that went on for several hundred years. But having said that, when the smallpox vaccine was introduced in 1849, Japanese medicine couldn't compete. Japanese medicine couldn't deal with smallpox. And as a result, it went into decline. It lost its place as a authority in the country. So the practice of and the knowledge of Campo started to go down. In 1867, this was the end of the Edo period, and that marked the end of feudal society. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of things changed in Japan with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So it was the end of the samurai era, essentially, and the beginning of the modernization of Japan. And we can, of course, take into account that that's going to have significant implications for the practice of medicine. So, continuing attempts were made to integrate Japanese and Western medicine concepts, but often at the neglect of the important local knowledge. So, already the Western medicine framework had been able to exert itself as the dominant medical framework, even within Japan. And so Japanese practitioners of medicine positioned themselves as lower than Western medicine practitioners and Western medicine concepts, and as a result often neglected the power of their own medicine, the knowledge that did exist and the effectiveness that did exist within their own medical traditions. So the conceptualizing of the meridian system within Japanese practice of medicine moved away from notions of a larger sense of flow towards local point stimulation. So as you'll know from your study of the lectures on Chinese medicine, we understand that there's a meridian system, which is a network of pathways of movement and transfer of energy through the body, which we refer to as qi in Chinese medicine, or ki in Japanese medicine. And this is a fundamental belief system within these medical systems. So these ideas, this basic idea in Japanese medicine started to get forgotten, started to lose importance. And the idea of the points, the acupuncture points that sit on these meridians were useful not for their larger context, but merely for their local influence. So the use of acupuncture in Japan at the time started to become different. The purpose for putting needles into the body started to become different. It wasn't to influence the movement of energy around the body, it was to influence some sort of movement of blood and energy in the point that the needle went into. And that's quite a change, quite a divergence from the original theories. So relegated to the edge of medicine, Japanese medicines, including acupuncture, moxibustion, and kampo, fell into decline. Unfortunately, there was the risk of a lot of loss of that very rich historical, cultural knowledge. But luckily, a neoclassical revival sprang up in the mid-1920s. And this was sort of led by a passionate group of practitioners who wanted to hang on to and perpetuate this traditional medical knowledge within Japan. So they built on the original pre-biomedical traditions. What they were able to do was they were able to find these links to some practitioners, some rare practitioners that were still alive and still practicing. We're talking from the 1868 and the Meiji Restoration through till the mid-1920s. So it's some period of time, but these neoclassicists were thankfully able to find these rare practitioners and convince these practitioners to share their knowledge, so that this knowledge could be maintained. And luckily the neoclassicists have been able to reinvigorate these ways of practice, so the ways of practicing kampo medicine and the ways of practicing acupuncture and moxibustion. So, what are some basic kampo concepts? Well, here they are. Inyo, which is basically a Japanese exploration or understanding of the Chinese concept of yin and yang. Gogyo, or the 5 lines, this relates to the Chinese concept of the 5 phases: fire, earth, metal, water and wood, and the relation that these elements have to the structure and function of the body, the organs within the body. Ki. So ki is a fundamental substance. Ki is the Japanese understanding of the concept of the Chinese concept of qi. Sui and ketu are, well, as we see here, water and blood. These are understood in terms of their ability to sustain and continue the operation of given organs, and can become unwell in their own right, and treatment can be aimed at rectifying the state and amount of SOCH and Pt2. And then short diagnosis. So once a patient's signs and symptoms are collected, the practitioner forms a diagnosis based on the pattern of disease, which then directs them towards selecting the appropriate herbal medicines for treatment. So if we look at it, it's very, very similar conceptually to Chinese medicine. Okay, as we move into the break, a few revision questions. What practical relationship does Buddhism have to Japanese traditional medicines? And how do you think Shinto might have contributed to the development of Japanese medicine? And other food for thought, what links, if any, do you see between Japan's shamanic origins and its continued use of traditional medicines today? Okay, so time for a break now. I will see you very shortly.